What is the book of Genesis?
And the book of Genesis is the first and foundational book of the Bible. In this book, you see God laying the groundwork and the foundation for our understanding of everything.
The world before the flood was a place teetering on the edge of annihilation. Cities thrived, but not with justice or compassion. Wealth, power, and cunning dominated every corner. Violence was ordinary, deceit rampant, and every human endeavor seemed aimed at self-interest and destruction. Humanity was on the brink, its survival hanging by the thinnest thread, and the stakes could not have been higher. If the world continued on this path, the very blueprint of creation was at risk. Yet, amid this collapse, Genesis offers a fleeting, almost overlooked version of the narrative. Today, we'll explore this so-called forbidden verse in Genesis, and the terrifying truth behind the flood will finally be revealed. The universality of the flood narrative. In the book of Genesis 6:5, the prelude to the flood is haunting. It says, "Every intent of the thoughts of the heart was only evil continually." By the time the narrative reaches this point, humanity is not simply flawed, it is structurally broken. Social systems failed, moral boundaries were erased, and corruption became self-sustaining. The flood, then, is introduced as a response to a world that has crossed a measurable threshold. Now, widen the lens beyond ancient Israel, and the same pattern begins to surface across the Fertile Crescent, a stretch of land covering Mesopotamia, Sumer, and Akkad, where some of the earliest urban civilizations emerged around 3000 to 2000 BCE. In these early cities, Uruk, Eridu, and Akkad, humanity is depicted as advancing rapidly: agriculture, writing, and law. But alongside this growth comes instability. Flood narratives begin appearing on clay tablets. The Epic of Gilgamesh, compiled in its standard Akkadian form around 1200 BCE, but drawing from older Sumerian sources as early as 2100 BCE, preserves one of the oldest known flood accounts. Here too, humanity becomes unbearable, and thus comes annihilation. Different culture, same conclusion. Something went wrong. In Genesis 6:6-7, God is described as grieving, regretting the creation of humanity. Out of this collapsing world emerges a single anomaly, Noah. Introduced in Genesis 6:9 as righteous and perfect in his generations, he is not powerful, not royal, not chosen for status, but for integrity. The instructions he receives are precise. Build an ark of gopher wood, seal it with pitch, dimensions roughly 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, approximately 137 meters by 23 meters by 14 meters, depending on cubit length. The mission is preservation. 2 of every kind. Food for survival. A floating archive of life itself. Across the Mesopotamian plains, the same blueprint appears with different names. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the survivor is Utnapishtim. He is warned by the god Ea. The instructions are just as specific. Build a massive boat, seal it with bitumen, bring family, craftsmen, and animals. The vessel in this account is described as a cube, equal in length, width, and height. The parallels are too consistent to ignore. Warning, construction, preservation. These are not random similarities. They reflect a shared narrative environment across the ancient Near East. Then comes the moment everything collapses. In Genesis, the flood begins with precision, 40 days and 40 nights of rain, but the waters prevail for 150 days. This storm is sustained, overwhelming, and total. All the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. Every land-dwelling creature outside the ark perished. The Mesopotamian version is just as relentless. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the storm rages for 6 days and 7 nights. By the 7th day, the world is silent, flattened. The boat comes to rest on Mount Nisir, echoing Genesis, where the ark rests on the mountains of Ararat. Birds are released, first a dove, then a swallow, then a raven, to test the waters. The sequence is nearly identical to Genesis 8. When the waters finally recede, the tone shifts from destruction to recalibration. In Genesis, Noah exits the ark and builds an altar. The response from God is immediate and decisive, a covenant. In Genesis 9:8-17, the rainbow becomes a sign, not just for humanity, but for God himself, a reminder never again to destroy the earth by flood. This is a binding promise. Humanity is given a new start, but also new rules, prohibitions against bloodshed, a reaffirmation of human responsibility, It is, in effect, a reset of civilization. Utnapishtim's story reaches a similar endpoint. After the flood, he offers a sacrifice. He and his wife are granted immortality, set apart from the rest of humanity. There is no universal covenant here, no moral contract, just survival and separation. Yet the core idea remains. Life continues because something was preserved. In both traditions, the flood is not the end. It is a recalibration of existence. But the story does not stay contained within these two traditions. Variations begin to emerge as texts are copied, translated, and reinterpreted. The Septuagint, a Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures produced between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE in Alexandria, adjusts genealogies and timelines, sometimes extending the lifespans of pre-flood figures by hundreds of years. The Samaritan Pentateuch, preserved by the Samaritan community, offers its own numerical differences and textual variations. These are not contradictions as much as they are interpretive layers. Clearly, the story was alive, moving through communities, adapting to context, and then there are the hints. Genesis 6:4 mentions figures who were present in those days and also afterward. It does not explain. Instead, it simply leaves a trace. Later traditions, especially those found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, which were discovered in 1947 near the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, begin to expand on these fragments. Texts like the Book of Giants and other apocalyptic writings suggest that the pre-flood world may have contained more than just human corruption. They speak of unusual beings, hybrid lineages, and a deeper layer of disorder. Across the Fertile Crescent, flood stories continue to surface. The Atrahasis epic from Akkad, the Eridu Genesis from Sumer, each adding detail, adjusting cause, refining consequence. In some, humanity is destroyed for noise. In others, for overpopulation, and in others still, for moral failure. But the pattern holds. A threshold is crossed, a warning is given, a vessel is built, waters rise, life is preserved, the world begins again, and that consistency is the real mystery. Independent cultures, separated by language and geography, preserve the same narrative skeleton. Something happened that left an imprint deep enough to echo for millennia. By the time the narrative settles, one thing is clear. The flood is not just a story about water. In fact, we haven't even told the whole story yet. The biblical flood narrative retold. In texts like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, the story opens differently. The world is not just morally unstable. In these versions, it is being altered. These writings introduce a group known as the Watchers, a class of angels assigned to observe humanity. According to 1 Enoch, chapters 6-7, around 200 of these beings descend to Earth, led by figures like Semjaza and Azazel. Their descent is deliberate, coordinated, and irreversible. They do not come to guide. They come to participate. What follows is described with unsettling clarity. The Watchers take human women as wives, forming unions that are explicitly forbidden within the framework of ancient Jewish theology. The result is the birth of the Nephilim, beings described not just as large, but as destabilizing. The text does not treat them as a metaphor. It gives them scale, appetite, and consequence. They consume resources at unsustainable levels, and when those run out, the narrative says, they turn on humanity itself. Violence is no longer human-driven. It is amplified, accelerated, and engineered. This is where the story begins to diverge sharply from the familiar account in the book of Genesis. In Genesis 6, the Nephilim are mentioned briefly, almost in passing, but in Enoch, they are central. You see, the Watchers do not stop at physical unions. They teach. That detail is critical. According to 1 Enoch 8, they introduce metallurgy, weapon-making, cosmetics, enchantments, and astrology. Azazel, in particular, is singled out for teaching humans how to forge weapons and manipulate the natural world. This is framed as acceleration without restraint. Knowledge arrives before wisdom. Technology appears without ethics. The imbalance deepens. Fragments of this expanded narrative were discovered in the mid-20th century among the Dead Sea Scrolls, found in caves near Qumran on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. Among them were portions of the Book of Giants, a related text that further develops the Nephilim storyline. These documents, dated between 250 BCE and 68 CE, confirm that these ideas were circulating within certain Jewish communities during the Second Temple period. They were copied, preserved, and studied, now returned to the flood itself. In this expanded version, God's decision to destroy the earth is no longer framed solely as a response to human sin. It is a response to contamination. In the Book of Jubilees, particularly chapters 5 to 7, the flood is described as a necessary act to cleanse the earth of both human corruption and the consequences of angelic transgression. The Nephilim are thus the epicenter of the chaos. Their existence represents a breach in the created order. This reframes the urgency of the flood. In Genesis, God sees that all flesh had corrupted its way. In Enoch and Jubilees, that corruption has a source, a mechanism, a lineage. And yet, the story does not end with the waters receding. A question lingers, one that the canonical text does not fully resolve. In Numbers 13:33, centuries after the flood, Israelite spies report seeing the Nephilim again, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. The text records their fear. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. The implication is unsettling. If the flood was total, how do these figures reappear? The Enochic tradition offers a framework. Some interpretations suggest that the spirits of the dead Nephilim remain active. Others imply that remnants of their lineage persisted through unknown means. The texts do not converge on one explanation. What makes this version particularly striking is not just its content, but its intent. It attempts to answer questions the Genesis account leaves open. Why was the corruption so complete? Why was the response so absolute? Why do traces of the same phenomena appear later in the narrative? The Enochic and Jubilean texts do not shy away from these questions. They build entire frameworks around them, and yet these texts were not included in the mainstream biblical canon. Why do we have different flood narratives in the biblical tradition? The moment you begin comparing flood narratives, the tension appears almost immediately. In the book of Genesis, chapters 6 to 9, the story flows from human corruption to divine judgment to the ark to survival, and then finally ends with the covenant. But then a few books later, in Numbers 13:33, the narrative flickers. The spies report giants, Nephilim still present in Canaan centuries after the flood. It's a brief line, almost easy to miss, but it opens a fracture. If the flood erased all flesh, why do echoes of the same beings persist? That question doesn't get answered in the canonical text. Step outside the canon and we get some clarity. Texts like the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and fragments like the Book of Giants found among the Dead Sea Scrolls don't treat the flood as a simple moral reset. They expand it into a layered crisis involving angels, forbidden knowledge, and hybrid offspring. These texts were written roughly between 300 BCE and 100 CE, during a period known as Second Temple Judaism, when Jewish thought was diversifying under Persian, Greek, and later Roman influence. To understand why some versions survived as official, while others did not, you have to follow the slow construction of the biblical canon itself. The Hebrew Bible, also called the Tanakh, did not arrive fully formed. Its three major divisions, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, were recognized over centuries, roughly between the 5th century BCE and the 2nd century CE. The Torah was stabilized first, likely by the 5th century BCE, while the prophets and writings took longer to settle. This was not a single council decision, but a gradual consensus shaped by usage, authority, and tradition. The criteria were not arbitrary. Texts had to be associated with recognized prophetic figures or leaders, align with established theological frameworks, and, critically, be used in communal worship. This last factor mattered more than it seems. A text read publicly, copied regularly, and taught across generations gained authority through repetition. Others, even if respected, remained on the margins. The Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees were known, even valued in some circles, but they were not universally adopted in synagogue life. That limited their trajectory. Then came the Greek shift. By the 3rd century BCE, Jewish communities in Alexandria produced the Septuagint, a Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures. This version included additional writings not present in the later standardized Hebrew text. Early Christians, emerging in the 1st century CE, inherited this Greek corpus. That matters because many of the earliest Christian writers did not read Hebrew. They read Greek. Their Bible was already broader. Evidence of this overlap appears in the New Testament itself. The Epistle of Jude, likely written between 60 and 90 CE, directly quotes from 1 Enoch 1:9, treating it as prophetic material. Early church figures like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Origen were aware of Enoch and sometimes referenced its themes. especially regarding angels and cosmic rebellion. For a time, these texts existed in a grey zone. The turning point came in the 4th century CE, when Christianity moved from a persecuted movement to an imperial religion under Constantine the Great. With legalization in 313 CE and increasing institutional structure, the need for a standardized set of scriptures became urgent. The Council of Nicaea marked the beginning of formalized doctrinal boundaries. Once orthodoxy was defined, texts began to be evaluated against it more rigorously. The real consolidation happened in regional councils, like the Council of Hippo and the Councils of Carthage, where lists of canonical books were proposed and ratified. These lists closely resembled the Old Testament, as used today in most Christian traditions, largely aligned with the Hebrew canon. By this stage, texts like Enoch and Jubilees were excluded, not erased, but instead labeled as apocryphal or pseudepigraphal, meaning attributed to ancient figures but composed later. The reasons for exclusion were layered. Some texts presented theological ideas that were difficult to reconcile with emerging orthodoxy, particularly detailed accounts of angelic interbreeding and complex hierarchies of spiritual beings. Others were simply not widely used in liturgy. A text that is not read in church, not copied regularly, and not taught across regions struggles to gain canonical status. Authority, in this context, is as much about practice as it is about content. One figure who solidified this trajectory in the Western Church was Jerome, who, around 382 to 405 CE, translated the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate. Jerome made a deliberate choice to prioritize the Hebrew texts over the broader Greek tradition. This decision effectively narrowed the Old Testament canon for Latin-speaking Christianity and reinforced the exclusion of texts like Enoch and Jubilees. His influence was enormous. The Vulgate remained the standard Bible in Western Europe for over a millennium, and yet exclusion from canon did not mean disappearance. In Second Temple Judaism, particularly among the Qumran community, these texts were preserved with care. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947 in caves near the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, contained multiple copies of Enochic literature. This indicates that, at least for some groups between 150 BCE and 68 CE, these writings were not fringe. They provided explanations for cosmic disorder, the origin of evil, and the mechanics behind events like the flood. And that is why multiple flood narratives exist. But there is another area that demands better illumination. Who were the Nephilim actually? In the book of Genesis, just 4 verses interrupt the flow of the flood narrative. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they took wives. Then, almost as an afterthought, the text names them, Nephilim. The passage is only about 90 words in English translation, yet it has triggered centuries of debate. Who were these beings? Why are they mentioned right before the most catastrophic event in biblical history? And why does the text move on as if nothing unusual has happened? For most readers, the story ends there. The flood comes, humanity is judged, Noah survives, and the world resets. However, in the book of Enoch, the story does not begin with humans at all. It begins with observers. The Watchers, which were angels assigned to oversee humanity, are described as descending to Earth in a coordinated act of rebellion. Their number is fixed at 200, and their descent is tied to a specific location, Mount Hermon, in what is now the border region between modern Syria and Lebanon. Their leader, Semjaza, binds them under oath, knowing the act they are about to commit cannot be undone. The transgression is immediate. The Watchers take human women as wives. The text does not soften it. It presents the unions as intentional violations of divine boundaries. The offspring, Nephilim, are described as beings of immense size and strength, but more importantly, of overwhelming impact. They consumed all the acquisitions of men, stripping away food, livestock, and labor until nothing remained. And when human systems could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. This led to total collapse. Agriculture failed. Supply chains vanished. Survival itself became uncertain. Ancient measurements in later traditions describe them as reaching 300 cubits, though scholars widely treat this as a symbolic exaggeration. Still, even conservative interpretations suggest they were perceived as far beyond normal human proportions, something closer to a force than a people. The scale matters because it reinforces the imbalance. Their presence alone distorted everything around them. The world in their time is described as filled with violence. This violence was not random. It reflected a breakdown of order under pressure from beings who could take without restraint. What began as excess turns into domination, and domination into systemic chaos. By the time of the Book of Jubilees, the corruption expanded beyond consumption into culture itself, but their physicality was only part of the problem. The Watchers brought knowledge. Azazel, for example, taught how to forge weapons from iron, how to shape tools for war. Others introduced astrology, enchantments, and cosmetic arts. This was premature exposure. Technology arrived before ethical frameworks could contain it. The result was acceleration without control. Violence became more efficient, corruption became systemic, and thus came the flood. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.